At that time, Broad Street had a balcony, and they could sit in the balcony. They could not join the church. They could not function in the church. So at the corner of Long and Garfield was Ogden Hall. The theater was called the Ogden Theater. It wasn't called the Lincoln. So they met on the second floor in a prayer or Bible study group. And then they said to the Presbyterian Church, we want to have our own building, because we had our own building wherever they came from. It was about 23, 24, my mother and a couple of her sisters. So Reverend Lee, who had the responsibility going all over the country when Black folks said they wanted to have a Presbyterian church, particularly in the North. And he came to Columbus and he saw that these people were really serious. He checked into their background. So he said to the national office, there should be a church in Columbus. So on Garfield, the city was going to build a school, an elementary school. And this group of 23, 24 said, we would like to buy this property, build the church right here. So the city said, okay, we'll sell it to you. We've been there ever since. Yeah. So she was born, she's a legacy Presbyterian. Don't act like it, but she is. And
she's now the second oldest member of the congregation.
Yeah, the other, Irene, is
123.
103.
The church was opened
1918.
1918. So 1918.
Yeah.
And then they also, 2 doors down, bought a house that served as a manse for the minister. So,
yeah.
And that house has now been rehabbed and gentrified. And then the first minister of Bethany was Reverend Holloway.
No, it was Reverend Cooper.
So can we talk a little bit more about what you experienced about families moving up to the North? Can we get that?
Blacks, were promised 40 acres and a mule, and they didn't always get it. And so they were looking for places where they could prosper, and they would move to the free states, and Ohio was a free state. And one of the reasons that they came, of course, was for better opportunities. And the existing professionals in the North, in the free states, often had to go south to get staff. For instance, Dr. Method had a hospital at 17th and Long here in Columbus, Ohio. And he, in order to have enough nurses and medical staff, he had to go south and invite those folk who were trained to come to the North. That's how my mother and her sisters came to Columbus, because my mother was an RN and she moved to Columbus because everyone thought moving to a free state was offered more opportunity and a better life. This wasn't always true. And they lived, when they first came, they lived on what was called Water Street. Water Street is now Front Street. And then as their economic situations improved, they began to move east. So in moving east, my mother and some of her friends.
Okay, let me ask a question about your mother and aunts, because as I understood it, there were 3, and the 2 that came as nurses were actually supervised by the 3rd one. Was that correct?
No, it is not correct. My mother was an RN. Julia was a musician. I don't remember what Aunt Gertrude did, and because there were times when Julia, after they organized Bethany, Aunt Julia would play for Bethany, but they were all Presbyterians, though.
Okay.
Yeah, they were all.
And then how did your father's family
My
come?
father came over here from Indiana, and my father's mother was a slave, and I never got a chance to know her because she died before I was born. But my dad worked on the railroad. I don't know where he met Mother, but meet her he did, marry her he did, and he went to Bethany for a while, for about a year, but he actually preferred the Baptist church, and so then he went over to Shiloh and was active in Shiloh until he died.
And then I understood that your mother passed when you were 10. How did that significantly change your life?
My mother did what?
Died.
Well, you know why she died? And I am very supportive. I used to head the Columbus Planned Parenthood because I believe in it. And my mother died because of a botched abortion. And so it impacted my life considerably because I was the only girl. So Dad taught me to cook. The boys did the cleaning. Mother left a sewing machine, and I kept bugging Dad about I wanted to learn to sew. And one of the reasons I wanted to learn to sew was because I wore those little pleated skirts and midi blouses. And other girls, my little girlfriends and classmates in school, had the little cute blouses on with lace around the collar. And so I thought if I learned to sew, I can make blouses that looked like the other little girls wore.
And were there families in the community that supported you during this time? Or your family? Supported your family?
Of course, because they felt sorry for Mr. Boston and all those children.
Well, why didn't he split them up?
Because he said he was going to raise it. The mother died. In those days, they brought the funeral home, brought the bodies home. So after the funeral, my brothers and I were on the landing leading upstairs because I wanted to hear what the adults were saying. And so Uncle John from Pittsburgh, my mother's brother, said, well, David, what are you going to do with all these kids? You want us to take some? And Dad said, no, I'm going to raise the children myself. I'm going to keep them here. And they talked back and forth. But at that time, when there was a death in the family and there were a number of children left, the children were split up. They were usually had other members of the family would take one or two, or they were sent to the orphanage. And at that time, the orphanage was at the corner of Fifth and Nelson. And so Dad said, well, I'm going to raise the children myself. And so he kept us together. Well, of course, the neighbors would feel sorry for poor Mr. Boston and all these children. And when they should have been feeling sorry for Ann, because I was the only girl. But at any rate,
so this was 1933, at the beginning of, or the height of the Depression, and he kept these kids.
Yeah, he kept us. Okay. And my dad, he always had a job. He still worked at the railroad, and then instead of working full time at the railroad, he was part time, but he still worked there. We were the only family in that section of 22nd Street that had a car. So Dad would I guess you would call it a jitney service, but for those who were on welfare, he would he would send my brothers in their little red wagon over to the firehouse on 20th and get the food and bring it back for the various neighbors who were on welfare. And so I don't drink milk today because people would give us skim milk. We call it Blue John because it has a blue cast. And so I don't drink milk today. I drank milk when I was pregnant. I drank milk for the 9 months that I breastfed. And once I stopped, I was through. I haven't had milk since.
Okay. You attended East High School. Did that prepare you for whatever it was you wanted to do afterwards?
When we went to East High School, George and I signed up. You had to sign up for.
Okay, I'm sorry. Who's George?
My twin brother. And I signed up for college prep. You had to sign up for college prep, home economics, or what was that the boys did? The shop, yeah, mechanical arts. Okay. So Marie Google was the principal, and she called us, George and I, into her office, and she said, "We have changed your schedule." And I said, "And what way?" And she said, "Well, we have a job for you. You and George can leave." And she did this with a lot of the black students. We have a job for you. You and George can leave the school at 2:00 to go work in this family in Bexley, because that's East High School was on the periphery of Bexley at that time. I looked at the lady. I thought, she has got to be crazy. And I said to her, "Well, we don't want to change because we're going to college." And she said, "No, we've arranged for you to work in this family and you can leave school every day at 2:00. So we said, we are going to college. So our aunt was in town, and when we went home, we were telling Aunt Julia about it. So she said, "Well, I'll take care of it." And the next day, she went to East High School and told Marie Gould, the principal, that we were not going to work in anybody's home, that we were going to stay in the college prep program. Well, lo and behold, I ran for student council and won. And she saw to it that I didn't win the next time when I ran again, because we had crossed her. I wanted to be in the drama club, and she wouldn't let me participate in that. The only thing that I was able to participate in, and I did not think of it as a career opportunity, was to write for the X-Ray, which was the name of the school paper. And so I did. But I'm telling you, I went one time to an alumni meeting, and there was a person there that I had not seen in a number of years. And I said to her, "Well, where did you go to school? I've really missed hearing about you." She said, "I didn't go." And she was one of the smartest students, black, blue, green, or white. But she had not gone to college. So I said, "Well, why not? What happened?" Because I know you have a number of scholarship opportunities. She said she had one of those jobs where you left school at 2:00 to go work in a family. And she said, "I just never had all the money to go to school." And that has been, I won't say I have worried about it ever since, but it has bugged me ever since to think that this is one of the smartest women in our class, and she was denied the opportunity of going to college. Because Miss Google, because she wasn't married, she thought that the black kids should all have a job in somebody's kitchen.
And what was the ratio black-white in the school at the time?
Well, there were about maybe 200 blacks throughout the school. Maybe.
All right. And then during the summer, you did happen to pick up on tennis. How did that affect your life?
Oh, Julia Lynn, I played tennis, varsity tennis for East High School because Thelma Fall and I played tennis. Thelma was a young Jewish girl, and Webster was the coach. He did not care about the color. He just wanted to win. And so he asked Thelma and I to play on the varsity East High School varsity team because we played better than any of the boys he had. And if I remember, well, I better not say it, but there was only one school that objected when we played them and we won, East High School won. They objected because they had been defeated by a black and a Jew. I never forget that. So for a long time, unless East High School has taken it down, there's a picture of me in tennis outfits with the tennis team. I played tennis because I got tired of playing all the sports my brothers played. Putt-putt, marbles, basketball, softball. And I tried to get my twin brother to play tennis with me, but he would not. So this was in the 30s, 1930s. And when I, in all due respect to Billie Jean King, when she talks about finding scholarships today for tennis players, I thought, gee whiz, the black schools had tennis teams back in the 30s and the 40s. Well, anyway, I played tennis and I liked it and I was good at it. Still am. The coach came through here from Prairie View, Texas, watched me play. And then he said, well, would you like to come to Texas? I said, sure. So when I graduated in June 1940, I was almost 16. Or maybe I was 16, almost 16. George and I. And he offered me a scholarship, full ride, to play tennis for Prairie View. I tried to get George to go with me. George didn't want to go south. He was afraid to go south. And he was going to Detroit and go to Wayne and live with Uncle Fletcher, which he lived to regret. I went to Texas.
And so this Prairie View experience is academic, but just continuing this in terms of tennis, then did you play for the team during the summer as part of your scholarship?
Yeah.
Or
you had to because, we graduated like the 1st of June here in Columbus from East High School. By the 1st of July, I had to be in Texas. I had to be there before the 1st of July, actually, because of the tennis schedule. And just as with softball, there was what we call, and even with entertainers, what we call the Chitlin route, there were black teams all over St. Louis, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, Detroit, all over. And so the Beatty Park Tennis Club would map out a schedule. And Dad would not let me go on all the trips, but like Cleveland, Cincinnati, he would let me go on. And because one, he thought I was too young, and most of the members of the Beatty Park were men, but they took care of me. Nobody abused me because I was a good player. And so anyway, I played on the route every year. And then when I got to Prairie View, and Warren, who was the basketball coach, found out I could play basketball, I was on the basketball varsity team. But I went there on a full ride as a tennis player at academic.
Perhaps we can skip a bit, and let's just. When and how did you get married?
How did I get married? I got married at Bethany Presbyterian Church.
How did you meet your husband to be?
I was active in high school. They had the YWCA had a youth council, and I was the representative from East High School. It was just for black kids, and I was a representative from East High School for the youth council. And Linwood, who turned out to be my husband, went to North High, and he represented North High. And I say that to say that I don't really remember him at that time, but he remembers me. So let's just skip over. I graduated from college. I'm working in the YWCA in Chicago. And I want to go to the east. I've always wanted to go east to Connecticut. And I had relatives living in Connecticut. So I applied for a job in Connecticut, and the job was scheduled to come through in a couple of months. So my father said, well, sister, why don't you come home? You haven't been home for a while before you go to Connecticut. I said, okay. So I came home. And a friend of mine called one day, and he said, are you busy? And I said, no. He said, well, we need readers at Ohio State. I said, readers for what? What are you talking about? And Ohio State paid people to read to the blind students. And Bob had a friend who was the first black Marine from Columbus, Ohio. And he had been injured. Mine explosion, which had destroyed most of his face and all of his sight. So he had gone back to Ohio State to finish up. He was a junior when he left to join the Marines. And so Bob said, well, he needs a reader. I said, okay, I'll read. And so I started reading to him. And Ohio State paid you to read anyway. So I started reading to him. Found out that we had been in the youth council together. Found out that he had been by my house on 22nd Street. And my brothers told him I wasn't there. And I probably wasn't. The reading led to a relationship. And one day he called and he said, did you eat your strawberries? And I said, no. He said, well, go ahead and eat your strawberries. So I got the strawberries out of the refrigerator. As I went through them, there was a diamond ring. So we got married.
Okay. All right. Again, a lot of editing going on here. So then you.
But let me say, we did get married.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about it, that nobody wanted me to marry him. My pastor was pointing out, because he wanted me to go to Union Seminary, and I didn't want to be a pastor, but he wanted me to go, and he was against it. My aunts were, my mother's sisters, they were against it. And Dad said, well, whatever you want to do, sister, is okay with me. And then when I were married 50 years, yeah.
But at the beginning, shortly after completing Ohio State, doing other things, you made a move to Chicago. Why was that?
When Linwood he came back to Ohio State, and as I said, I was reading to him there, and he graduated from Ohio State, and he was teaching at Central State University, and Jesse Owens spoke at Central State, and when he saw Linwood, he said, "Man, I need you in Chicago." And
just to clarify, they had been friends from North High.
Well, no, when Linwood went into the Alphas, Jesse took him over. That was the fraternity that Linwood joined. And so Jesse said he headed the Southside Boys Club in Chicago, and he needed somebody like Linwood to work there as a program director. So Linwood came home, told me that he was resigning from Central State to go work in Chicago. I hit the ceiling because I had lived and worked in Chicago, and I knew the history or the reputation that the Southside Boys Club had under Jesse Owens. But he had made the commitment, so we moved to Chicago, and he worked there. Anything else?
And then we returned to Columbus.
Linwood was the first student to graduate from Ohio State University with a degree in, what did they call
criminology.
it? Huh?
It's criminology.
Yeah, criminology. And so Dr. Simons called us. He stayed in touch with Linwood. And he called us in Chicago and said that the Ohio Penitentiary had decided to hire professionals. The guards came from rural areas, and they didn't have the background that they felt they needed to work with the prisoners. So he asked Linwood if he would consider coming back to Columbus, to Ohio, to the Ohio Pen. Once again, Linwood made a decision without discussing it with me. So we moved back to Columbus, and he went to the Ohio Pen. And he was there until they had a big riot, and they moved the young boys, young adults.
Inmates.
They moved them up here to the fairgrounds to an honor camp, and people began to complain about that. So then he went to
It was Lucasville.
No, he didn't go to Lucasville.
No, but that's where they put the others.
No, because they asked him to go to Lucasville, and I told him if he went to Lucasville that we were getting a divorce, because I felt that it was not the proper educational background for the 4 children that I had.
Okay. But during the early 60s, when you came back to Columbus, late 50s, early 60s, there were a lot of changes.
There were
a lot of changes. I mean, even when you first got married, you lived on Jefferson, and that was the beginning of the...
No, we didn't. We lived on 6th Street.
Okay, but then you moved to Jefferson.
Yep.
So then that was right on the edge of Fort Hayes. And so now this was the street. This was the beginning of the acquisition of land for the interstate. So how did that affect you and the community as a whole?
It destroyed the community because, it wasn't just Columbus. Wherever they were building the interstate throughout various cities, it always went through the Black neighborhoods. And so we did not want to sell our property. We were across the street from the Fort Hayes. They were not taking Fort Hayes. but they were taking the streets adjacent to Fort Hays, Jefferson, Lexington, Hamilton. And we got a lawyer, and Bill Brooks came by one day and he said, Annie, he said, if you don't sell, they're going to take your land. So we didn't, we decided, well, rather than lose the land completely, that we would sell it at the price the city was offering, and which is what we did. But that whole area became 70 East.
When you were living on Jefferson, to what extent did you use the area just east, which we now know as Bronzeville, King Lincoln District? To what extent did you use that in terms of shopping or professional services, whether it was doctor or whatever?
The East Side used to be a self-serving community. You never had to go outside the community for anything because you had all the services there. And even though, say, you had a department store like Dan Zigger's, blacks could not try on clothes, but they could buy clothes, so you didn't have to go downtown. So it was a self-serving community. Once the freeway came through, all of that was destroyed. And it really has not been recaptured in its entirety. And this is 2021. Businesses were closed. Housing became a problem because of the expense of a mortgage. It was just devastating.
Well, if you look back, and I know there are a number of different people, but if there are 3 or 4 people that you look back and you say, these are people who particularly inspired me or guided me or ensured or mentored me.
I remember I was in the first or second grade, and I had a crying spell. And Miss Jenkins was a teacher, and she came to me. And in those days, they would call you, well, Miss Boston this, Miss Boston that, or Miss, rather than Ann or Julia or whatever. And so she said, why are you crying? And I said, I'm the only one in this class without a mother. And I remember her looking at me and she said, well, there's nothing you can do about it. Your mother is dead. But as smart as you are, you can be and do anything you want to do. So stop crying. And I have never forgotten that. When I was in Washington, D.C., she called me to say that she expected me to be in Columbus that weekend for her 90th birthday. So I said, what are you talking about? She said, I'm celebrating my 90th birthday and I want you to come. That's a 7-hour drive from Columbus to, from Washington to Columbus, 7 hours each way. But she said to be here, and I was here. When I went to WVKO, she would call me and she would say, now, that is not the proper pronunciation for maybe whatever word I had used. But she stayed on my case, and I have just never forgotten her. And she was just one of a number of people who had a lot of faith in my ability to achieve, who helped me set goals. And not long ago, a building was named after me. Can you believe that? I couldn't. I participated, but I was shocked.
And so what are the professional achievements that you have in your life that enabled them to name this building after you?
I don't know. I really don't know. I do not think I have achieved anything that deserves that, but since they felt that I had, I accept it.
And what might those have been?
I didn't train for it, but I became a journalist. I went to television. I went to radio first.
Actually, you started with writing to Sentinel.
Well, I did. I had a friend who was the editor of the Sentinel, and Russell said, "Ann, I need some help. You write well. Do you have time to write some short editorials?" I said, "Okay, I'll do it," because I was home with you all, so I needed an outside contact with adults. So then I went from, well, I didn't go from, I stayed at the Sentinel, but then I also went to to WVKO because they were having a hard time staying alive. And the board had told the general manager that you need to find something that's going to keep us on the air. So they decided, well, we'll hire some blacks and this was a trend across the country to hire blacks. And there's a woman at the Byron Bowman Advertising Agency who said, well, you ought to look at Ann Walker because she writes editorials for the Sentinel, and they're good. So I was called and asked to come for an interview as a commercial writer. This is a person who writes the commercials. Okay. I was at a friend's house one night while she was at a wake for her mother. And my husband called and said, Ann said WVKO is called and they want to talk to you. And I said, about what? He said, I don't know. They just want to talk to you. So I said, well, if they call again, tell them I'll call when I get home. I got home about 10 o'clock and I called. And sure enough, they were still at the station. And Bert Charles, the general manager, said, we need to have you come up here. I said, for what? At 7 o'clock, 10:30 at night. And he said, well, we want to talk to you that we've got a problem. Well, I insisted on finding out what the problem was. And the problem was that they were going to hire, I was going to be a commercial writer, yes. They were going to hire Castleberry as a disc jockey. And then they were going to hire a young woman who had been on Amos and Andy. And she was from Columbus. They were going to hire her as the female voice of VKO. And they took her to a press conference and she got drunk. So Bill C. Lander, who was the sales manager, said, he told Bert, I told you to hire Ann Walker, that she would be better for the position. And they had planned a luncheon. This was on a Tuesday. They had planned a luncheon on Thursday to introduce this new voice of VKO. So I said, well, I don't have a voice, And they said, well, we can do a lot. Just ride the game. So they tested me, and I didn't recognize my voice. I sounded so good. Anyway, they said, well, you're going to be the new voice of VKO. So that was Tuesday night. On Wednesday, you know what I did? I made an appointment with a hairdresser. I went looking for a dress to wear. And Thursday, I was introduced as a new voice of VKO. And that was great because it gave me an opportunity to start a program I call Youth Speaks, because I thought it was so important for our kids to know the job opportunities that exist in broadcasting. And it was more than just being a disc jockey or even reading news, because Bert would hire disc jockeys, say, like Les Brown was brought up from Florida, Bill Moss came from Florida, as disc jockeys, and I had to train them to do news. So in April 1967, they were going to bring a young man up. And so Bert said, Ann said he'll be here on Monday, and this is what we want you to do. And I said, I'm not doing it. I said, I did Eddie Castleberry, I did Les Brown. I said, I'm not doing it. And I went in my office, packed up my stuff, and went on home. And so I moved from radio, so newspaper, radio, television. And for the longest time, I was the only one in the city that had worked for all three.
And so what was the position you moved to? And what institution? Or?
The assistant, the assistant director of community services. In 1959, Dr. Martin Luther King was in town, and he said that he would only be interviewed by a black person. Well, none of the stations had blacks. The newspapers didn't have blacks. So this person again at Byron Bowman said, well, why don't you use Ann Walker? And I was called by a station and asked if I would interview Reverend King. So I said, well, sure. Now, why did I say sure? His wife was a good friend of my husband. In fact, when Linwood and I became engaged, she had the audacity. She went to Yellow Springs in Antioch, or went to Antioch in Yellow Springs. So she had the audacity to come to Columbus to meet me to see if I was good enough to marry my husband. I laughed at her. I said, if you wanted him, then you should have married him. Well, after she left Antioch, she went to Boston, and that's where she met Dr. King. So anyway, I agreed to do the interview. And because of who King was, more people watched it than normally might have, you see. And they remembered. And so when they were looking for new staff, I was one of the persons they called. But we had one of the school principals, after I went to Channel 4, he came up there with his vice principal. And in fact, Odella Welch and I were talking about this just the other day. He came up there with his vice principal to say that I was a troublemaker, that I was not a good role model for young people, and that they should fire me and hire somebody else. So Dick Reed said, look, we tried to hire Ann Walker several years ago, and we could not pay her enough. And she told us, when you can afford me, I'll come. And said we could afford her. And they did, because I think the pay was $85 a week. And I had you all. You were home, it cost more than that just to hire a babysitter. So I couldn't afford to work for $85 a week.
So what were your responsibilities at Channel 4, WLWC?
Well,
or what were your accomplishments?
It was a management position, so that I had a budget, and it was a matter of hiring and firing, developing programs. One of the things that I did set up there was an internship, because once again, just as I had youth speaks at radio, so I had the internship at Channel 4. I thought it was important that young people recognize the many jobs that existed in the broadcast field. I remember Ohio State said, well, I wasn't qualified to develop a intern program. And I said, oh, but I am. Not only in terms of academics, but in terms of experience. I said, they had hired a fellow, I can't remember Paul's last name, but he had worked for ABC for 25 years. And they had hired him, no degree, they had hired him in the School of Journalism. So I thought that if he had no degree and he was hired, then, and I have a degree plus, then I should be able to develop the internship. And I did. And it was important that students who participated get credit. That was important. And so I had to go to each department and say, would you be willing to give me part of your budget to pay for this program? And fortunately, all the departments agreed, and it worked out beautifully. And they had the intern program until I left.
And in terms of actual programs, those that went out over the air, what were some of the ones that you developed?
Okay, let's start early in the morning. Columbus Today. First, it was a live show, and then we worked out so that it could be pre-taped. Okay, Columbus Today. Focus on Columbus was a discussion show aired on Sunday. And I had a chance to meet a lot of important people like Alex Haley and John Glenn, you know. Then Doctors on Call. First, the medical academy said that they didn't want to participate. And I convinced them that it was important because people had various illnesses and they didn't always understand what they needed to do to be healthy. So I called it the disease of the week, not on the air though, but I called it the disease of the week. And it opened with a beating heart and blood running, so that would really catch people. And in fact, when they first brought the mammogram to Columbus, if you remember, and I needed a body, and you were home from school, and I asked you to come up to the station so we could tape you as we talked about the importance of women having mammograms.
It's my only time to appear nude on television.
Then I like jazz, and there used to be a jazz club up on North High Street, and I'd go up there and sit maybe around 11 o'clock at night until about 4 or 5 in the morning. And the black musicians would tell me the difficulty they had getting gigs. So I said, why? They said, well, we don't know. And so this professor at Capital University had just organized a jazz orchestra. And there are 30 people, I think, in that orchestra even today, but they only had 2 blacks. So that didn't make sense. So I thought, okay, maybe we could do a jazz program. I didn't have time to do it, so I asked your brother, who liked music, if he would host this show if I produced it. So as long as I stayed within the budget, the general manager did mine. The more shows that we had on the air, the more people that would watch Channel 4. So at any rate, this guy who had started the jazz orchestra, which exists today, came to the station and told the general manager that I was discriminating against white folks, white musicians. I couldn't believe it. So the general manager came down to the office. He said, Ann, tell me what's going on. So I told him what was going on. So he said, oh, I'll back you. He said, if that's the picture. I said, no. I said, ask him, go back and ask him how many blacks he has in the orchestra. And so, and the person who came to me was teaching music at Ohio State University. So we did the Market Jazz. At Kenyon, over in Kenyon, I'm trying to think of this fellow's name. Oh, not Fats Waller. Anyway, the son of a musician. I can't think of his name. I guess. Anyway, I called him and I said, we're developing a program called the Market Jazz. It's only a 15-minute piece. Would you be interested in participating? He said, oh, yes. I said, seriously? He said, yes. I said, why? He said, because we have so little exposure as Black musicians. So I said, okay, you need to come to the station, blah, 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 blah. And he was there, and Philip was there, and Philip, hosted the program. And I thought, well, I've got something. If he is willing to come from Kenyon, Ohio, to participate on a 15-minute program, there is really a need for Black musicians to have this kind of exposure.
And so then now, why did you leave Channel 4?
When I went to Washington to work for Carter, my assistant called me one day and she said, Ann, I just can't do all that you did. So I just really need more help. And I said, well, go to the general manager and explain it. And, I gave her several points to use. And then I called him and I said, Ben, Daryl is having a difficult time and she needs an assistant. And he said, okay. So when Carter loses and Reagan lets me go and I come back to Columbus, Ben said, what time are you coming back to the station? I said, what am I coming back to? He said, well, I can't afford to increase your salary. I said, what do you mean? You just hired an extra person to work with Daryl, and you're now telling me that money is not available to me? I guess he thought, here is this 40-some-year-old woman who's so excited about being on television that she'll work for nothing. But I wasn't that excited. So I said, well, I've been here 15 years. I'll retire.
And what did you do for Carter in D.C.?
Media director for the Community Action Program. The Community Action Program was the Poor People's Program. So we wrote speeches. we whatever we could do to sell the program so that people would vote for Carter, that's what we did. Because the day that, I remember in 1980, the day that election day, I was in Albuquerque trying to sell Native Americans on Carter. And a lot of people voted for Carter, and those who did not, I think since then have wished they had.
So I wanted your perspective. I want to take you back to the difference between before there was Poindexter Village, the first housing project, to once they put the village there. What were your experiences? How do you feel it impacted our community, and how important was Poindexter Village to our community?
I was in college when Poindexter became an actual housing unit. Before then, you had people living in huts. Many of them didn't have running water, didn't have indoor toilet facilities. They might not have had electricity, all that kind of thing. Once the housing unit went up and the president, Roosevelt, came to Columbus to dedicate it, the lives of people permitted to live there changed tremendously. My twin brother, when he came out of service and went back to Ohio State, he lived over there with his wife and 2 children. It was affordable housing. Today you hear people talk about affordable housing. Is $1,100 a month affordable, you know. But then it was affordable housing, and you also had, as I said before, services within the area, so people didn't have to go uh, downtown to shop. They could just go around the corner, you know. And then you had the schools right there because you had the Catholic schools as well as the public schools. So I just think that the lives of those who moved in that area, moved into the project, improved tremendously.
What do you want people to know about the resilience of Black Columbus?
About what?
What do you want people to know about the resilience of Black Columbus?
The Black community, you know, when I was a youngster growing up, there weren't that many Blacks living in Columbus, and they lived in a given area. And they were limited to certain jobs, you know. Since then, even though I had moved in and out of Columbus, every time I come back, and I'm back here to stay, I'm not moving anymore. Every time I come back, I'm impressed with the growth of the Black community. I'm impressed with the jobs, the positions that they hold. You know, there was, you know, when I was a kid, I could count maybe on two hands the number of Black doctors. There's so many Black doctors in Columbus now, it's impossible to know them all. When I was working to make sure that I knew who they were, as soon as I heard that one had moved to Columbus, I would send a note, say, welcome. You know, same thing with pastors. I think that in spite of the racism that continues to exist in Columbus, I think that Blacks do not let, and not just Blacks, you know, Blacks, the Asians, the few Native Americans that are here, they do not let their feelings of resentment cloud their vision. And that's important. That's really important. I think, though, that the schools need to be improved. I was asked 2 years ago if I would take in some foster kids. And I said, sure, why not? I've got time, I've got house, so I will do this. And then I really thought about it. And I thought, I can't do it. I really can't do it because there's been very little change in the school system. I had to send my own children away from Columbus. You know, I had to threaten when Dr. Ivan said, no, I could not. I had to send Julia Lynn to Franklin. And I said, no. I said, I'll take you to court before I'll send her to Franklin. I'm sending her to Champion Junior High, where I felt the teachers had more concern about her learning, and that, so that was important to me. So here, that was in the 60s. So here this is 2020, 2019, and I'm going to end up doing the same thing in 2019 that I did. I said, no. And the person who talked to me, you know, tried to explain to me that the county would give me more help. I said, no, they won't. No, they won't. And so I felt badly, but I had to say no. And I knew that I have something to give to young people. I knew that. But I knew also that I would not be able to give it because I couldn't send them away to school.
So the Poindexter Village Museum and Cultural Center will represent more than just the public housing story.
Yeah.
When you think about the future of the museum, what do you hope to see?
I'll say something, and somebody said, "Oh, I didn't know that," and I thought, "Well, why didn't you know it? It's a part of our history. It's part of Columbus's history. It's a part of our history as Blacks. So why don't you know it? And you don't know it because it hasn't been taught. You know, um, I should have brought it with me. If I had fully understood what the discussion was going to be, I would have. But there's a Sankofa bird, which is an African uh, symbol, and it says that you can't move forward without knowing what has happened in the past, and that's so very true. You know, so because when I say some of these things, people say, "Oh, well, I didn't know that. Well, why didn't you know it? Why don't you know it? Why wasn't it taught?" You see.
So the future generations, when they come into Poindexter Village Museum, um, what are some highlights that you hope that we make important in that museum? Or is there anything that in your that you just want to make sure that we do in that museum?
Well, Julian has worked more closely with that than I have, but I think that as part of that, they'll certainly understand how uh, people were living back in the 30s and the 40s and how far they have come in terms of their uh, education. And that sounds contradictory to what I just said about the public schools, but it really is not. It really is not. And I think that uh, it's important for us to know the contributions we have made and to take pride in knowing that and in the accomplishments. I think that's very important, you know.
And what would you say to future journalists, Black journalists, and uh, young people of color who seek to get into the radio, television field? What would you say to them, or what advice do you have for them about that?
What advice do I have for them?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I had hoped it would keep going and that they would uh, have workshops and encourage young people to attend because, when people look at me and they say, "Oh, Ann, so you major in journalism?" No, I didn't major in journalism. Well, but I said, yes, I had all these opportunities. And when the door opened, I walked through, but I always tried to bring somebody along with me. So when I organized the Columbus chapter of Blacks in, let's call it Blacks in Media, that's not the correct name, but anyway, um, I was hoping that this would happen. You see, it isn't just enough for us to have the opportunity. We have an obligation, it seems to me, to open the doors for somebody else. Um, there's a person who was at Channel 4 who was an engineer, and he retired about 4 or 5 years ago. There's a person there who is the weather, you see, because I did a lecture at Bowling Green, and he came to me afterward, and he said, "Well, I want to get in television." And I looked at him and listened to him, and I said, "You need to go into an area where there are no Blacks. Don't just think of news and look at weather." He's been doing weather now for over 30 years, you see. So I think we have that. If we can't say, if we can't point to those that we have helped to enter the field we're in, then we really haven't been successful. We've been more selfish than anything else. Um, And I can't tell you all the people whose lives I've impacted, but I know that there was one girl who was the director of the journalism school at Shaw University. There was a Columbus boy who was down in I think it's Tallahassee, Florida. He just retired about 4 years ago doing news. So that kind of thing is important. It has been important to me. Whatever I was doing is to make sure somebody else who might have an interest could do it too. But you know what I wanted to be in the beginning? A YWCA secretary. And I worked as a YWCA secretary in Chicago at the Southside YWCA there, 45th and South Parkway. And that's why I always smile when people say, "Oh, you trained did you go to Ohio State School of Journalism?" Nope. I just went in the back door.
That's great. I was going to ask you one more question just about the importance of churches and the things that are surrounding our community. We noticed that there are a lot of churches in the Bronzeville community and surrounding the Bronzeville community. And a lot of those churches, it sounds like you've seen the beginnings of some of these churches popping up into our community. How important is church to the African American experience in telling our story?
I think churches are important because for a long time, you see, that was the seat of learning for Black people. And through the years, it increased the responsibility, even with the civil rights movement. It took place in the churches. I think that churches, though, have to be willing to change and move as the community changes and moves. And unfortunately, some of them are not. Even in the Presbyterian Church, of which I'm a staunch member, we have those who say, well, that's not how we did it before. Or they'll say, when someone is suggesting a change, they'll say, well, if you want to be a Presbyterian, you have to act the way they act. And I think that's not true. I think that one of the reasons you have Rock City, you have what's the other one that Debbie's a part of?
New Life.
Huh?
New Life.
Okay. They move with the interests of the young people. And so on Sunday mornings, Rock City has 4 sites. And this other group has at least 4 sites. And they are packed every Sunday morning. The music is what the young people like. The message is what the young people like. And the older folks evidently like it too, because they go along with it and they support it, and they are tithing and giving their money. So I think that in the Black community, we have to be as willing. And there are several groups like the Apostolic, very conservative. But if they aren't willing to move with the young people and then follow that trend, they're going to die out, you see. And that's unfortunate because, years ago, that's where you learned, in the church.
We didn't touch on Africa at all. Do you want
where were we?
Zambia.
Zambia? Is that where they wanted to make you a queen mother?
No, but that's where you met.
No, I'm talking. We were in Africa, Julia Land and I, and where were we? Nigeria? And I said, no, she was too young to be a queen mother. She got mad at me. So years later, my husband and a friend, we were in Zambia, as she said, having lunch. And in walks the king and his entourage. And someone in the group said, well, there's Madam Walker sitting over there. Let's talk to her now. Now, the king of this village, Mozano, which is a small village outside of Accra, which is the capital of Ghana, had been looking for a queen mother. And they had a queen mother. This woman became the queen mother in 1922. And she said, one day a queen mother will come from across the water. Mm-hmm. So the king thought this was a good time to bring a queen mother over from across the water. Some of his members of the village was hoping it wouldn't be a white woman. This is what they said to me. Several people said, why don't we ask Madam Walker? Because they knew I was going back and forth so frequently, 4 or 5 times a year. And they knew that I didn't take somebody from America to go to Africa to give a lecture on Africa. I used the people there at the university or in the community. So they knew that I had a real interest in Africa. So here we are having lunch in Lusaka. You want to know what they were eating? Grasshoppers. Not me, though. Nevertheless, the king came over, introduced himself, and said that your name has been suggested several times, that we ask you if you would be willing to serve as a queen mother. And I knew what a queen mother did, because we were bringing students over, and there was a student up in Aburi whose mother was a queen mother. And she had asked me about whether or not her son could come to America and go to school. So we finished the lunch. The king and his group met later. My husband went upstairs to take a nap, and they met later. And they said, he said, we would like to have somebody who really has an interest in Africa, to become the queen mother. And then as I said before, your name came up. So I said, well, let's talk about it. So we talked about it, And then he said, I will send you information that you should receive by the 1st of July. Well, July came and July went. I got no information. Then in August, there was a flurry of emails, I guess. And one was, what time were you born? I didn't know what time I was born. So I called my twin brother and I said, can you work out, because he was good in math, and it took a mathematical equation, I guess, to determine my actual birth time. So George said, okay, I'll work it out for you and get back to you. The reason they wanted to know, because that would determine what name they gave me. I didn't know that at the time. So anyway, when I told them that, and then they said, well, we need to have you come over and learn the language. The language is Tree, which is a part of the Shanti languages. And, oh, Father, I'll never make it. And I told Julia Lynn that I had to go over and learn the do's and don'ts of being a queen mother. Well, several times I said, look, I quit. I'm going back to Columbus. No, Nana, we need to have you here. We need to have you here. I said, well, either stop yelling at me or I can't pronounce whatever they wanted me to pronounce. And the day started like at 6 o'clock in the morning with prayer. So I just decided I had bitten off more than I could chew. And they said, no, we want you. So finally I said, well, okay, I'll give it I'll stick with it. And Julian said, well, I'm going to bring some folks over. And then there were people in Columbus. So we're going to get a group together. We'll come over. And that's how I became a queen mother. But there were several times when I said, you got the wrong person, not me. But it has worked out. Unfortunately, there are those who tried to take advantage of the fact. For instance, I had a friend in Maryland who gave me a lot of medical equipment, and that's what they needed for their clinic, the village clinic, And they got it wasn't the king, it was a chief who got mad because I didn't bring some drugs. I said, what kind of drugs? You need medical equipment. They would have to, if somebody became really ill, they would have to go 2 miles to the next village to get a taxi to come to Mozano and take the sick person to the hospital, which was like a half hour away. So Julia Lynn had a station wagon. So I said, well, give me the station wagon for the village, So she did. And I, had it serviced and gave it to the village. It had put on there Mozano Medical Clinic. Well, I don't know where that station wagon is. Because next thing I knew, the chief was driving a $60,000 car. And which meant then that people who became ill still had a difficult time getting to the hospital.
Mm-hmm. But are there other ways in which you believe you contributed to the life of the village?
Well, they have all the families have children who, once they were adults, would move, say, to London or France, just leave the village. So I said to them, I took a group over and we were going to have lunch at the village and there was no bread. Well, who ever heard of an African eating without bread? So they said that they ran out of bread. So I said to them, those of you who have children in abroad, when they want to give you something, have them give you equipment for a bakery. And then you could train the young people to become bakers. The village will have enough bread, and then they can get jobs in other cities. So they did that. Then we did the same thing. They wanted to have a library. The women wanted to have a library. So I went down to the Cape Coast to find out how you set up a library. And I was amazed. All you had to do was find an acceptable building and put some books on the shelf, and you had a library, you know. So I came back and told the village, this is how we do it. And so I had bought paint, and they found a housing that was given to them for a library, and they painted the building, put in shelves, painted the building, and the library board and Cape Coast gave us some books. I had a little outside area where the kids could go outside and sit and read the books, you know. And then also in one corner of the backyard, and in the other corner, I had them put in a toilet so the kids could, or anybody could use a toilet. And I went over there, and it was closed. I said, what do you mean it's closed? Someone had made a decision to close the library. Now, this is what the women wanted, to close the library and move. Oh, I got someone to give us computers.
Mm-hmm.
And they moved all the computers to the high school. So I said, well, I don't understand what's going on. Well, we just thought it would be better. Who is we? Men. Men dictate what happens in a village.
All right. Well, finally, you also had experiences with bringing African youth over to Columbus for high school. Can you briefly share what that was or why you did that?
I did it. We brought kids over, students over, I guess about 30-some kids to go to school in Columbus. And I would bring them over when they were seniors so that it would give me a year. They were going into the 12th grade. That would give me a year to find out what kind of students they were and to find schools that would accept them, because your state institutions do not give money, even today, do not give money to undergrads. So it had to be a private school like Capital, which is private. Ohio State would not give money to undergrads, but Capital would. Kent State would. So, excuse me. So students would ask, "I want to go to school in the U.S. Can you help me?" You know, and I had a good friend who used to work for the YWCA in Minneapolis, and she was back in Senegal. So I said, if you would choose the students and do the first interview, then when I come over in April, I'll do the second interview. And if we agree, then that student could come to the States. And when they finished, many of them would go back to their country, and some of them stayed here. I remember one kid who played soccer at Independence, because he was one of the few that I didn't send to Columbus Alternative, because he was such a good soccer player. And he wanted to go to Yale. So he was telling me about the guidance counselor, and I said, well, I'll go out and talk with him. So when I went out, he said, well, Ms. Walker, I don't deal with schools like that. I only deal with schools in Ohio. So I said to Papa, I said, let's just write our own letter, which he did. And because he had not been involved in community activities, Yale wrote back and said that, academically he would have been acceptable, but that they wanted a well-rounded student. So they did not accept him. Ohio Wesleyan was going to give him $26,000. And Howard University was going to give him 10, I think. And the more I thought about it, I thought he needs to go to Howard. And he could understand why I said, no, you can't go to Ohio Wesleyan, because they were giving him more money. And many of them came from poor families. But I said, you've got to go to Howard. You need to have that experience of rubbing elbows with all kinds of Black people. So he went to Howard. And by hook or crook, we were able to get him through. So Julian and I went over for the graduation, and he said, Nana, I am so glad you made me come here. And he's with the World Bank now. He's back living in Senegal, but he works with the World Bank. Yep. We've had some who go back to their country and become politicians. We have others that will stay on this side and get good jobs. Yep. And that's what I mean when I said that you have a responsibility. I don't care what it is you're doing. You have a responsibility, it seems to me, to make sure that whatever you're doing, you do it so well that somebody else wants to do it too. You see, and then you help them achieve that.
So we moved away from, but I just want to do one quick one in terms of Valleydale. And
what about Valleydale?
What role did it play in the social life of African Americans on the Near East Side?
By the time you came along, Blacks could have activities at Valleydale. They went to it. They had they had their dances there. The sororities, fraternities would have their dances there. And then they also, there's only one cotillion in town, and it's in the Black community. The Victory Matrons sponsored that. And it was held at Valleydale. And in fact, I used to tape it because, as I said to the general manager, we do the Hope Ball, we do the Symphony Ball, we do the art, Museum of Art. Why can't we do the cotillion? It's the only Black social activity that involves teenagers. So they said, okay, Ann. And so we started taping that. And when I said we do the Hope Ball, it was just like a 15-minute segment that we would go to the affair, tape it, and then show it the next day or the next 2 days on Channel 4. And a couple of years ago, a woman called me, and she wanted to know if I was going to tape the cotillion. And I said, no. She said, oh, I wish you would. My daughter is in it this year, and blah, 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 blah. I said, honey, I haven't taped that since around 1983, And I said, call the station and tell them you want them to do it because there's no reason why they shouldn't. But I haven't seen it, and I've been back in Columbus since 83. So, but a lot depends on what you see on camera, depends on the interests of the leadership of the station and the legal guidelines. Because when I was involved in the business, you had to do a certain amount of community service. Do you see community service on now? And not only that, I understand that they charge. I produced, when I was talking about the programs, I produced, we had the church programs, Swagger, and different groups like that. And I said, well, why don't we have a Black church on? Well, the white churches were paying to be on. And I said, but if we use a church in the local community, they shouldn't have to pay to be a part of our community service. So I invited all, like the Baptists and the Methodists, and they came up to the station. I said, this is what we want to do. And they started telling me how to do it. I said, oh, wait a minute. If I came to your church to speak in your pulpit, I wouldn't tell you how to run your church. Now, you know nothing about running television, and you're going to tell me? I said, why don't you go home and think about it, and then I'll call you back. But they went home, I guess. Anyway, Reverend Wright from Seventh-day Adventist called and told me that he'd heard what I was trying to do. And he said, we'll come up, and we'll do anything you want us to do if you let us have that opportunity. So I said, okay. And sure enough, again, when we said be here for a taping, they were there. When we said we need 3 songs, we had 3 songs, and they were there. And then when Reverend Wright was promoted to the national office in Bethesda, Maryland, a pastor there at Fairwood and Deschler Apostolic came and said the same offer. We'll do whatever you want us to do if you give us the time. And that's what we did. So as long as I was there, they were on. And then when I left, they dropped the program.
I wanted to know about the markets back then. I know there was Carl Brown grocery market.
And what point? Because when she grew up, it's the East Market.
It was the East Market.
Yeah.
I would like to know more about the grocery stores. When you
about
were
the what?
Up, the grocery stores, the markets.
There was the East Side Market there at Mount Vernon, Miami to 18. There was the North Side Market where it is now. And there was the Central Market, which was down on 4th Street. So there were 3 major markets in Columbus.
Which one did your family go to, and
the
how
East
were your
Market?
Interactions at
the East Market because it was right here in the neighborhood. See, we were on 22nd Street, and that market was on Mount Vernon. We were on 22nd between Mount Vernon and Spring. The market was on Mount Vernon between 20th and Miami, 18th. Yeah. But my father, as many of the families did, had a garden. We had a garden in the backyard. And then there were plots over on McKinley Avenue that were leased out to those who wanted them. And we had a garden there. Because we used to, all of the kids, we'd have to go over and pick things, pick vegetables, and come back, baskets full, and cook them down and can them. I don't can today. I did so much canning when I was a youngster. I freeze stuff, but I don't can it.
And were there smaller stores in between where you went for canned goods or bread or that kind of thing?
Yeah, we do a market on Mount Vernon, Bethany Presbyterian Church, and Julia Lynn runs it. At 17th and Mount Vernon. Would you believe there are no mom and pop stores in that area where you could buy a loaf of bread or milk? It doesn't make sense. It does not make sense. And then there's on Long Street, there's one at 20th and Long and one at Champion and Long. It's right in the heart of the Black community, or was the Black community, because now there are so many whites moving in. But that's all you have. And so, people have to take taxis to go to Kroger's on Main Street, or they have to get somebody to drive them over, It just doesn't make sense.
I just wanted to get a feel of, I guess, the environment in the East Market when you all used to go. Was it more of a familiarity in that environment in the market? Was it more like a family feel?
It was a big market space, and the stalls were leased out
Okay.
so that if you could afford it, if you wanted it, if you needed it, you could lease 2 or 3 stalls, you know. And people brought produce from their garden, or they bought it wholesale. But Brown started out, for instance, with a horse and wagon, you know, and then he had 2 stalls in the East Market. And then he had his grocery store, the IGA grocery store at Champion and Mount Vernon until he died. And then his sons tried to keep it going, and they put up barriers because of the stealing of produce, canned goods, and finally they closed it. Yeah. But I enjoyed going down to Central Market because that was out on 4th Street because they had so many different things, you know, fruits, vegetables.
And the East Market burned twice. After the first time, it was put back. Then after the second time they forced it, wasn't put back. So there was no market on the east side from the early 50s on. And so all the shopping then went to Central Market, where the bus station is now, where Trailways Greyhound bus station is. That's where the market was.
You know, you talk about Bronzeville, the name Bronzeville. There were several cities across the country where the congregation of blacks was called Bronzeville. In the late 30s, Mayor Gesselman was the mayor of Columbus, Ohio. And he wanted to have a close contact with the black people in the black community. And so he decided that there would be an election. And they would elect a mayor, council members, and department heads. But they would have no real authority. But this would be his black cabinet, and that would give him direct contact with the black community. Now that's something that Chicago did not do because Chicago had a Bronzeville, Detroit had a Bronzeville, Minneapolis had a Bronzeville. Large cities like that had Bronzeville. There were about 5 or 6 cities that had an area that they called Bronzeville. But Columbus was the only one that elected a corresponding officers. And Reverend Scarborough, who at that time was a pastor at Trinity Baptist Church, became the black mayor of Columbus. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one of my tennis coaches, and he just died a few years ago. He was 104 when he died. He was head of the Parks and Recreation.
James Madison.
So for the first time, they appointed, or Mayor Ginther appointed a woman for the first time in the history of Columbus, head of the Parks and Recreation. And that was a couple of weeks ago.
And I think he also served as one of the first managers at Poindexter.
Yeah, he was.
Madison. James
Madison.
I think I've got some documents if you don't.
You know, the first school nurse, she just died about 5 years ago. She was 100 and something. Yeah. And then Champion Junior High, the principal, J. Arnett Mitchell. My first experience with classism, he told me, finishing 9th grade, going to East High School, he says, Miss Boston, want you to come wearing your nicest dress tomorrow because you're going to receive the Lit FISO Scholarship Award. So I came wearing whatever I had, which was a pleated skirt and a midi blouse. And the first award was given to Betty Ann Morrison. I thought, wait a minute, I know I heard him correct yesterday. So I asked, I was good at asking questions. I asked, well, why? You told me this, and why did you give it to Betty Ann? And Betty Ann and I were friends. And she and her brother were twins, and George and I were twins. So Dr. Mitchell said, well, her mother called me and reminded me that her father had been a doctor and your mother was just a nurse. That was my first experience with classism within the Black community. Oh, I was hot. But it never happened again. And I got a number of scholarships. It never happened again. And her twin brother, I think he ended up working for the post office, whereas my twin brother became a doctor, the first Black to be hired at OSU medical faculty. They took 2 students. George was number 1 in his class when he graduated. And he wasn't one of the 2 chosen. So I said, well, George, it's a political thing. Go up there and sit at the dean's office until he gives you an explanation. Tell him you want to be in this class. And normally my brother was kind of quiet like. But he really wanted to be accepted into the med school. So he went up there. I said, George, just sit there. Let the school close on you, because that's the way I am. But he wasn't like that normally. So he went up there, and he did sit there. And finally, the dean came out around 5 o'clock and said, well, young man, what can I do for you? So George told him, he said, well, I want to go to med school. And said I was number 1 in my class, and I wasn't chosen. And so, they talked back and forth. So finally, the dean said, okay, said we will take you. So that means they're taking 3 Blacks, but normally they only take 2. Well, George was a good student in the med school. And when he graduated, they hired him on the medical faculty, the first Black to be hired.